Hello, and welcome back to Dreamtime Stories. I'm Hattie, and I'm very glad you're here with me tonight. This evening's story begins with an inheritance and ends with a journey that nobody who has not taken it would believe. It is set in a house in the Welsh borders in the last week of October, when the year is drawing in, and the light has that particular quality of a season nearly spent. The house is full of mirrors, and one of them is a door. This is a quiet Gothic tale, one that settles slowly into the bones rather than startling the nerves. There are no sudden alarms, only candlelight, old silver glass, and the growing understanding that the woman who lived in this house before was trying, in her own extraordinary way, to leave a message, and that the message was always meant for Caroline. So, find your comfortable place now, let your breath slow, and allow the story to draw you gently down into sleep. There is nothing to work out, and nothing to hold on to. Just listen and drift. Our tale is called The Lady Who Walked into the Glass. The solicitor's letter arrived on a Tuesday in early October, and by the following Friday, Caroline Darkmoor had packed 2 trunks and arranged for a carrier to take them ahead to Hallow's End. She had never visited her great-aunt's house. She had never, in truth, met her great-aunt. Isadora Darkmoor had lived alone in the Welsh borders for the last 3 decades of her life, had sent no letters and received few visitors, and had died in September at the age of 81, leaving the house and everything within it to Caroline, the only remaining member of the family who bore the Darkmoor name. The solicitor, a careful man named Hutchins, who chose his words with evident deliberation, had described the estate as modest in size, but remarkable in contents. He had paused after saying this in a way that suggested he wished to say more, and had decided against it. Caroline arrived at Hallow's End on a grey afternoon, when the hills to the west were the colour of pewter, and the oaks along the lane had begun to release their leaves in slow drifts. The house itself was smaller than she had imagined. A stone building of 2 stories with a slate roof and deep-set windows, enclosed on 3 sides by a kitchen garden gone to seed, and an orchard where the last of the apples lay in the grass. It had the look of a house that had been very well kept for many years, and had only recently been permitted to lapse, as though it had been waiting for its mistress to return, and had, in the last weeks, quietly accepted that she would not. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, was a compact woman of 60 who had served Isadora for 20 years and who greeted Caroline at the door with a composure that only just contained what appeared to be a considerable relief. She had been managing the house alone since the death, she explained, uncertain what the new owner might wish to do with it, whether to sell, to let, or to occupy. Caroline had not yet decided. She had come to understand what she had inherited before making any determination about its future. Mrs. Price led her inside, and it was in the entrance hall that Caroline first saw the mirrors. There were 4 of them in that room alone, arranged at intervals along the walls between the coat hooks and the barometer, and a dark little watercolour of the valley that hung opposite the door. Each one was large and framed in silver, the silver gone to grey and in places to near black. The glass itself old enough to have the slight irregularity of handmade manufacture, minutely uneven so that your reflection moved through it differently depending on where you stood, now sharper, now softer, now stretched imperceptibly in one direction, like a reflection in still water when a very distant stone has been dropped somewhere upstream. Caroline looked at herself in the nearest one for a moment. The glass returned her face with a quality she found difficult to name, as though she had been looked at before by this particular mirror and was being recognized rather than simply reflected. She followed Mrs. Price through the house. The mirrors were everywhere. In the drawing room, 3 of them, each at a different height on different walls, so that whichever direction you turned, you encountered your own image at a new angle. In the dining room, a single enormous pier glass that reached nearly to the ceiling, its frame carved with a pattern of ivy that had been polished so many times the leaves had softened to suggestion. On the first floor landing, 2 mirrors facing one another across the narrow corridor so that your reflection multiplied into the distance between them, diminishing through successive iterations until it became too small to see. A figure retreating down a corridor that did not exist. In Isadora's bedroom, 5 mirrors arranged with a deliberateness that was unmistakable. Caroline stood in the center of that room and turned slowly, and wherever she looked, she found herself, 5 times over, each version occupying a slightly different depth, a slightly different quality of light, as though the mirrors were not all reflecting the same room, but each a subtly different version of it. She asked Mrs. Price how long the mirrors had been in the house. Mrs. Price considered this. The ones downstairs, she thought, had been there since before her time. Miss Isadora had added to them over the years, acquiring new ones from house clearances and dealers in old glass. She had been very particular about age. She would not have a modern mirror in the house. It had to be old glass, she always said, glass that had been somewhere before. Caroline asked if her great-aunt had ever explained why. Mrs. Price looked at the floor for a moment, and then at Caroline with the expression of someone who has held a private opinion for a long time and has decided this might be the appropriate occasion to release it. She said that Miss Isadora had believed that old mirrors remembered. Not in any way that Mrs. Price herself would endorse, she was careful to add. But that had been Miss Isadora's conviction, held privately and never spoken of to anyone who might have found it unreasonable. Old mirrors, she had said once, did not merely show what stood in front of them. They showed what had stood in front of them. All of it, compressed into the silver, deep in the glass, waiting for the right quality of attention to draw it back to the surface. Mrs. Price showed Caroline to her room, which was across the landing from Isadora's, and left her to rest before dinner. Caroline sat by the window and watched the last light drain from the hills and thought about old mirrors and what they might remember. She had been given, along with the house and its contents, a sealed box of papers from Isadora's writing desk. The solicitor had pressed it on her with a notable urgency, suggesting she look through it when she was settled. She had carried it from London in her travelling bag and had not yet opened it. She opened it now. The papers were not organised in any way that suggested they had been prepared for a reader. They were a mixture of household accounts, letters received and never answered, pressed flowers between sheets of brown paper, and at the bottom of the box, a journal bound in dark green leather, the covers worn soft at the corners. Caroline read for 2 hours while the fire established itself and the dark settled over the Welsh hills outside. The journal was Isadora's, and it covered approximately 5 years in the 1860s, written in a hand that was at first neat and precise, and became, as the years recorded in it, advanced, increasingly hurried, as though the thoughts were arriving faster than the pen could manage. Much of it was the ordinary record of a woman living alone in the country, the garden, the weather, the occasional visitor, the habits of a solitary and self-sufficient life. Isadora had kept bees. She had grown medlar and quince in the kitchen garden. She had walked the hills in most weathers and written about the valley and the changing seasons, with a precision that was neither romantic nor remote, only exact. The observation of a person for whom the visible world was reliable company. But running through it, increasing in frequency as the journal progressed, was a preoccupation with the mirrors. Isadora had begun collecting them in 1861, she wrote, after an experience in the mirror above the parlour fireplace that she described at first only obliquely. A quality of depth that had not been there before. A sense of the glass being more interior than a mirror had any cause to be. Over the following pages, the obliqueness resolved into precision. She had seen a woman in the glass, not her own reflection. A woman she did not recognize, seen not clearly but with sufficient distinctness to be certain. Dark-haired, wearing a dress of an unfamiliar cut, standing in a corridor that was not any corridor in Hallow's End. The woman had appeared for about 10 seconds and had then been gone, and the mirror had shown nothing but the parlour and Isadora's own face, pale and still, looking back at herself. After this, Isadora had begun to acquire mirrors. Old glass, she had discovered through a period of methodical experiment, showed the woman more reliably than new. She had developed over the following years a theory, written out in the journal with the rigour of a scientific paper, that very old silver glass accumulated layers of previous reflections, in the manner of sediment, each year adding its deposit to those beneath, until the accumulation became dense enough to hold its own images, independent of the present room. What she saw was not a ghost, she wrote, in any sense that she found useful. It was a record, an impression preserved in the silver, requiring only the right glass and the right quality of attention to become perceptible again. She had conducted long experiments of observation, recorded in careful detail. She had noted the dates and times and qualities of light under which the woman appeared, the age and provenance of the glass, the distance at which she needed to stand, the angle. She had filled pages with this. Her conclusion, arrived at over several years, was that the woman appeared most reliably at certain hours, in certain mirrors, when the light fell at a particular angle, and when Isadora herself had been standing before the glass long enough that her attention had passed through what she called the surface thinking into a deeper and quieter state of looking. She had experimented with placing the mirrors to face one another, and had noted that in the corridor on the first floor landing, where 2 of the largest glasses faced each other across the narrow width, the woman appeared with greater clarity than anywhere else in the house, as though the accumulated depth of 2 old mirrors combined was a richer medium than one alone. The woman appeared to her on average twice each month, and her behaviour was consistent across all the years of the journal. She stood in the corridor of her own image. She was still. She waited, and she indicated, with a gesture that Isadora described repeatedly and with increasing frustration, a direction. To the left. Always to the left. From the woman's perspective, with her arm extended and her face turned toward whoever stood on the near side of the glass. She had never discovered who the woman was. She had made inquiries among the older families of the area, had consulted parish records, had written letters to the solicitors asking what was known of the house's earlier occupants. The records were incomplete. What had been at Hallow's End before Isadora's own line arrived in the 1850s was largely undocumented. The journal ended in 1866 without resolution, the entries growing shorter and more fragmented. The last one reading only. She was beside the corridor again tonight. I think she is trying to direct me. I cannot make out where. Caroline set the journal down and looked at the fire for a long while. Then she took up her candle and went out onto the landing. The two mirrors there faced one another across the narrow corridor, and in the candle's single flame, their reflections ran away from her in both directions. Her image repeated and diminished through the glass until it became too small to resolve. She stood between them and held the candle still and looked into the one ahead of her. The mirror returned the corridor, the candle, Caroline herself in her travelling dress. She looked for a long time at the point where the reflections became too small to make out clearly. That region of successive images deep in the glass, where the corridor, the mirror invented for itself, stretched away into its own interior. At the very limit of what the candle's light could reach, the final visible reflection was not quite right. It was not facing away from her, as the perspective of diminishing reflections demanded. It was facing toward her. Caroline kept very still and looked. The figure was small with distance, its features unresolvable at first, but as she held her attention in the particular still and quiet way that Isadora had described in the journal, the depth of the glass seemed to extend a little further, the figure to draw a little nearer. Dark-haired. A dress of an unfamiliar cut, an expression not of alarm, but of a sustained and patient intention, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a considerable time and has grown very practiced at it. The figure raised one hand slowly and extended it toward the left side of the corridor it stood in, holding the gesture for several seconds. Then it lowered its arm and stood still, and its gaze across the impossible silver distance was entirely and unmistakably directed at Caroline. Caroline's candle flame bent slightly in a draught that came from nowhere. And then the glass before her ceased to be entirely a surface. She felt it before she understood it, a quality of the air against her face changing. The coolness of the corridor giving way to a cooler and stiller air that she could only describe later as the air of a room that had not been opened in a very long time. The mirror before her remained a mirror in every visible way, its silver frame tarnished, its glass clouded at the edges, returning her own image in its slightly altered manner. And yet, the surface of it, as she stood close enough that her breath should have misted the glass, did not feel like a surface at all. It felt like the membrane of deep water, present and real and yielding. She raised her right hand and pressed it very gently to the glass. Her hand did not stop. It passed through as though the mirror were not there, and on the other side of it the air was cool and still and smelled of stone and old wood and the particular mineral quality she had noticed in the house when she arrived, but purer here, more concentrated, as though she had reached the origin of it. She stood for a moment with her hand through the glass and the rest of her in the corridor, feeling the two temperatures, the lived-in warmth of Hallow's End at her back and the deep, still cool of the other place against her palm. Then she stepped forward, and the glass closed around her and opened ahead of her, and she was through. The corridor she stood in was Hallow's End, but not the one she had arrived at on Friday afternoon. The walls were the same stone, the proportions the same, but the house here was bare of everything that years of occupation deposit. No pictures, no carpet runner, no hall table. Only the walls and the floor and the cool amber light that fell from no source she could identify, diffused through the air itself as though the light here did not originate in any lamp or window, but had accumulated in the stone over a very long time, and was now releasing itself slowly back into the room. The figure stood at the end of the corridor, not small with distance now, but close enough that Caroline could see her face clearly. She was about 30 years old, and her eyes were very dark, and her expression was not afraid. It held a quality of relief so long delayed that it had become indistinguishable from composure, the relief of someone who has spent a great deal of time being patient, and has, at last, been given reason to stop. She looked at Caroline with the particular attention of someone reading a face for a family resemblance, and what she found there appeared to satisfy her. She turned to the wall on her left. There was a door there, low and plain, set into the stone in the manner of a storeroom or a cellar, and the woman opened it without ceremony and stepped back to allow Caroline to look inside. The room beyond was small and very cold and held very little. A stone shelf, a wooden crate, and on the shelf, wrapped in linen that had gone brittle and yellowed with age, an object that was clearly flat and clearly framed, clearly a portrait. Caroline stepped through the doorway and took it from the shelf. It was lighter than she expected, the linen crackling softly as she held it. She looked back at the woman in the corridor, who stood very still and waited with the quality of patience that had not diminished at all in however long she had been here, and who now simply watched Caroline with dark eyes that held a satisfaction, too old and too deep to be called anything as transient as relief. Caroline held the portrait against her chest and walked back toward the mirror. The passage back was easier than the passage in, a sense of the surface yielding almost before she reached it, as though it had been waiting for exactly this. She stepped through and was in the landing corridor of Hallow's End, the familiar warmth of the house returning to her at once, the candle still burning on the floor where she had set it down, its flame straight and steady in the still air. She stood for a moment and simply breathed. Then she unwrapped the portrait. The canvas was old and dark with age, but the image it held was clear in the candlelight. A woman, dark-haired, wearing a dress of a cut that belonged to a generation earlier than Isadora's, painted against a dark background with the precise attention of an artist who had looked carefully at his subject and found her worth looking at carefully. At the lower right of the canvas, in lettering so small she had to bring the candle very close, was a name and a date: Agnes Darkmoor, 1841. Caroline sat down slowly on the floor of the landing with the portrait in her lap and the candle beside her, and thought about her great-aunt Isadora, who had spent 30 years in a house full of old mirrors, looking for a woman who had been looking back, who had been pointing, with all the patience of the very long dead, at a door in her own house. And Isadora had not found the door, or had not been permitted through it, or had arrived at the end of her life before the glass opened for her. But she had kept the journal, and she had left the journal in the box, and the box had come to Caroline. She thought about Agnes, who had stood in the mirrors of Hallow's End across a generation and more, indicating a direction, extending her arm through the silver toward whoever stood on the far side of the glass with the patience of someone who understood that the right person would come in the end, and that the waiting, however long, was worth it. She thought about what it meant to leave a message in the only medium available to you, and to trust that someone, in the fullness of time, would follow it to the room it pointed toward. She went to bed in the room across the landing and lay in the darkness, listening to the old house breathe around her. The mirrors on the landing held their silence. The hills held the night. The fire in the grate released its warmth in steady, unhurried increments, and the darkness pressed softly against the windows, and the warmth of the bed rose around her, and her breath slowed of its own accord, and the weight of the day settled into her limbs and became rest. She thought, at the edge of sleep, that the house felt different now, lighter, in the way that houses feel when a matter long suspended has finally been resolved. Isadora had spent a lifetime with her mirrors and her careful journal, and had not quite found what she was looking for. But she had done what she could, and trusted that someone would follow the thread to its end. Caroline had followed it. The thread was complete. The house breathed around her in the dark, its mirrors quiet in every room, their surfaces still, their depths no longer held open with the effort of waiting, containing now nothing but the patient interior of Hallow's End and the long and wordless comfort of a thing that has been finished, at last, and can rest. She slept. And so Caroline Darkmoor lay in the dark of Hallow's End, with the portrait of Agnes on the writing table across the landing, and the mirrors holding nothing but the ordinary quiet, and the Welsh hills keeping their long watch over them all. Some doors open only once, but once is enough. Sleep well, dear listener. Until we meet again, good night.